just realized I don't know. I'm doing two electives. That would have been my third. How's it going?
It is. I would have to walk in front of the class if you want. I don't mind. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. When's the next class of this class? Okay. All right. If you think of it, can you send us a reminder email to do so, to add a laptop? I'll try to remember, but I also have to people. Yes. People. Unless
Because I understand, which is a comfort thing for me. I was having an interesting conversation with a friend. I was saying I find suits uncomfortable, both like literally, physically, but also psychologically. It's quite sure, right? To me, the whole culture of wear a suit to work, to me, it all seems like such a pain. Like, why do we all bother? Why don't we just wear normal clothes? He said, oh, because I actually like feeling, I feel like I'm professional and ready to go. Yeah, so your blog is that.
Those of you who are doing the meetings regularly, I think all of you, and that's good news because the readings for next session are particularly voluminous, so that we'll get 2 weeks to do a lot of reading. So don't delay it until the week after. So we're waiting for Professor Ajimolo. We'll get going as soon as he's done. So let me begin by thanking Professor Daron Ajimolo for being here, coming all the way down from the wrong end of Cambridge, and we're really grateful. You're walking into the middle of a kind of a part conversation, part debate that's going on between us and amongst all of us. You've been briefed a little bit, but not too much, I should say not enough to dissuade you from coming. So we are talking about what it means to talk about institutional change, institutional transformation, the role of experimentation, the role of institutional convergence, if possible, feasible, or desirable. And we're doing all of that in the context, in particular, of what we take to be the central economic challenge of today, which is the gulf that exists between what Professor Unger likes to call the vanguard and the rear guard of the productive sectors, the good firms and the good sectors that produce high productivity, rewarding work, and those that do not. And so our discussion on institutions takes place in the context, and will take place for the rest of the semester in the context of what kind of institutions are the ones that are desirable, that will actually bridge that gap and reintegrate, reunify these economies and provide a solution to the conundrum that exists both in the advanced and developing countries today, which is the traditional engine of economic growth, which is industrialization, has lost steam and is not working as in the past. So with that, I'll let you take over. Professor Ajimolo is just finishing up a new book, and he'll give us a short introduction, so that's a particular privilege. And then we'll open it up for a discussion. Thank you, Laura.
Okay, wonderful, Danny. Thanks. Thanks, Roberto. Thanks, Danny, for inviting me. Thanks for everybody being here. I didn't realize this was...
Turn it on.
Yeah, I didn't realize this was a debate. I should have prepared more. No, it's seriously, it's a great privilege. And And I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to talk about, but Danny mentioned the broad themes of institutions, technology, and sort of mentioned lessons from perhaps why nations fail. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to just give an extremely brief preview of a new book that James Robinson and I are just about to publish, because I think it's actually sort of relevant, although a lot of the book is about the historical process in which institutions develop, but the conceptual framework perhaps is still sort of relevant. So let me just say a few words about this. So where we start from, which I think is still relevant today, is what we call the Gilgamesh problem. So about 4,000 years before, Thomas Hobbes wrote about the Leviathan and how we need the Leviathan for a modern society. In the Sumerian tablets, probably first surviving writing from the city of Uruk, they tell of the story of King Gilgamesh, and the epic starts with all the wonderful things that the city of Uruk is benefiting from Gilgamesh's rule, amazing public works, gleaming streets, and flourishing trade. But there's a hitch. It quickly transitions to talk about the unrestrained, unhinged behavior of Gilgamesh. He's trampling its citizens like a wild bull. He is king. He does whatever he wants, takes the son from his father and crushes him, takes the girl from her mother and uses her. No one dares to oppose him. So it's a form of unbridled despotism where society has no ability to restrain or even have a say in what Gilgamesh does. So the residents of Uruk are desperate, so they do the only thing they know how to do. They call to the god of the sky, Anu, and they ask for help. So Anu comes up with the first recorded solution to the Gilgamesh problem, and her solution is checks and balances. So she asks for the creation of a double for Gilgamesh, Enkidu, who is his equal, and the story is that Enkidu is going to contain Gilgamesh, and the people don't have to suffer from his despotism. And in fact, the beginning of the story works out precisely like that. And the doppelganger comes and fights Gilgamesh. They sort of, nobody is victorious, but Gilgamesh, who was just about to have it away with somebody else's bride, his despotism is checked. So this might be the beginning of one type of solution to how to deal with the power of the state in a way that I perhaps actually were sort of more comfortable with. Unfortunately, if you read on in the story, you'll see that this solution doesn't work so well. Not only the fighting, not only if Enkidu now wins, who's going to control Enkidu, but an even more ominous thing: Enkidu and Gilgamesh gang up and they start fighting others in the rest of the epic. So I think the problem with the doppelganger solution, or the checks and balances, and in fact, even though it's the sort of the standard way that I think Americans and many other Westerners think about constitutions and sort of the formal institutions, part of institutions, as a way of getting the good from the state and not having to suffer the bad, well, it has a big shortcoming, which is who is going to actually police and monitor this arrangement. So in fact, the whole idea of the book, now given to you in 30 seconds, is that both in history and today, a much better way is to do this through society's mobilization. So in particular, you actually need the common people, not the political elites, not the people who are just empowered by the Constitution, but pretty much everybody who is subject to the state's writ to be part of the monitoring mechanism. And that's what we call shackled Leviathan, different from Hobbes's Leviathan. And I think, a lot of the argument in the book is about the non-economic consequences of this, but then linking to the economic consequences, because we think of the economic consequences as being very tightly linked to the social and political implications. So in particular, I think the key thing, which neither the doppelganger solutions nor absence of the Leviathan nor the despotic Leviathan is able to achieve, is what the philosopher Philip Pettit calls non-dominance. And dominance is, in his words, to live at the mercy of another, having to live in a manner that leaves you vulnerable so to some ill that the other is in a position arbitrarily to impose. So essentially the story that we're trying to tell, which I think has got a lot of relevance for the questions that perhaps we want to discuss in the rest of the session, is that you really need this sort of end to dominance in order to do the right sort of distribution of resources in society and energize the use of the society's skills, talents, creative energy, and so on. But this is a process. It's not something that you can achieve overnight. That's another difference between the societal mobilization solution as opposed to the doppelganger or the pure constitutional solutions. And this is what we call Red Queen. So the nature of what you expect from the state is very different too. So this is one of 1,000 pictures you can find to illustrate the point. But the issue that I want to illustrate with this picture is that you have something very different from what the people of Uruk would have thought about, or most people throughout the human history would have thought about. Here you have people protesting in the street, one way of what I'm calling societal mobilization, but they're not protesting in the street to ask the state to do less. They're protesting in the street to ask the state to do more. So in this instance, they're asking the state to actually spearhead a big refugee program in Germany, because that's what a significant fraction of the population at the time wanted, and the German state was not forthcoming at first. So they're asking the state to use its power to take on more responsibilities. And this is an essential part of what we call the Red Queen, which is that once society is confident that it has at least a chance of controlling and monitoring the state and transmitting its wishes to it, then you can actually have a situation in which the society is going to call for new and additional powers of the state. So schematically, this is what we think about. So this captures a lot of the words that I've mentioned. So of course, it's a huge simplification, but again, I'm going to come back to this in a second. So the narrow corridor that was in the title of the book is that area in between. And this is the only place, so to speak, where the shackled Leviathan has a chance of emerging. Why? Because you need a balance of power. You need a balance of power between state and society. Many of humanity's social organizations are in the lower right-hand corner where state institutions are too weak, but many others that we have experienced over the last 2,000 years are the upper left corner where the state is too despotic, too strong. And it's only in the middle that you have this balance of power. And the other dynamic notion here that's very important is that actually if you look at the arrow in the middle in that narrow corridor, it's actually going to much higher levels of state capacity than what you can achieve with the despotic Leviathan. So today we are daily fed interpretations and news that if you want the state to function well, you need to have something like China, where the state is despotic and democracy, Western democracy, or any other kind of participatory untidy politics is doomed to fail. Well, the picture that emerges from here, and which we try to defend in the book, which I'm not going to have time to do here, of course, is complete opposite. So it says that actually it's only in the corridor that you're going to truly achieve much higher levels of state capacity. In the despotic part, you're not going to do it because you don't have society's contestation of power and you don't have society's cooperation. And both of those are actually the death knells of state's capacity to develop in a functional dimension. So, but perhaps also relevant for today is that in the way that you have doorways into the corridor, you also have doorways out of the corridor, so you can leave the corridor. And that happens when the Red Queen effect, which is that competition between society or parts of society and states and elites, turns zero-sum. So many examples of this can be provided, of course, but most important for my very brief talk today is that this is much more likely to happen when economic elites or bureaucratic military elites work to undermine societal mobilization. That turns the competition much more zero-sum in character. When the economic fundamentals make the corridor narrower, we can talk a little bit about that. It's not actually that relevant for the US, but it's more relevant in general. And institutions are not up to the task of adjudicating conflict. So because conflict is everywhere, and when you sort of are incapable of having the institutions do that, they're much more likely to spill into other domains with detrimental effects. And then relatedly, when trust in institutions is undermined, and again, that has some economic and political foundations, which we can talk about. And then, of course, economic hardships, inequality, creating discontent. And all of these are familiar to us today because some versions of them are present. And the problem of dealing with new technologies, creating more prosperity, they all intersect with another problem, which is actually we will be lucky if we can keep what we have. So there is a real danger that many countries are at the mercy of events that they cannot control that might actually roll the clock back in unforeseen, undesirable directions. Well, it's not the only place where that happened. You know, many other shocks have created such junctures. And there are very different types of responses are possible. And in fact, one set of responses were highlighted in a landmark report that William Beveridge spearheaded at the London School of Economics in 1942, in the middle of the war. And it was very much what we would call the social democratic vision of a universal healthcare system, social security system, minimum wages, employee protection, and so on and so forth. And essentially, the argument of the report, very much building on what was going on in Scandinavia at the time, for example, was that new hardships required more to be done by the state. And this was a very important event, actually, during the war. For example, in the words of James Griffiths, it was one of the things that in the darkest hours for Britain in the middle of the war that energized everybody. And in fact, despite the fact that Britain was under siege at the time, they started implementing the Beveridge report right away. But there was a brilliant émigré from Vienna who disagreed vehemently, and this was the beginning of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, which was first a memoir he wrote for William Beveridge. And Hayek's concern was that, actually, if I put it in terms of the framework that I have developed here, is that this would take Britain out of the corridor. And his view was, this mean, among other things, that even a strong tradition of political liberty is no safeguard if danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. So he thought that by asking the administrative power of the state to increase, you were disrupting the balance. You know, he didn't put it in the language that we are, but it's very much in that spirit. And of course, Hayek was mistaken, and he was mistaken in two ways. One, a little bit more parochially. He was wrong about the need for redistribution, social welfare, etc., that I think is much more obvious to us today than it was in the 1940s. But the second is that he did not actually see the Red Queen effect, which is that when you actually are in the corridor and you are not completely gripped by this zero-sum competition, when the state is asked to do more, society can also rise up to that and develop new capabilities in order to deal with those challenges. And in fact, the history of the birth of social democracy in Sweden is very much along those lines. And, and it's this sort of joint evolution of the capabilities of state and society. So the implications for today, which is where I will end, is that I think those issues are actually quite urgently relevant. It is critical that the right diagnosis of what are the additional new responsibilities that need to be shouldered by, you know, the state, but also perhaps other aspects of the institutions of society is identified. But this has to be done in a way that maintains balance of power. It often necessitates new coalitions. That was the key, for example, in the Swedish case, where completely new coalitions, first between workers and farmers, and what they're called the Red-Green coalition or the cow trade emerged, and then the business interests joined that coalition after the 1936 election. And then this has to be done in a way that trust is actually maintained in institutions in various ways. This is relevant to the road to serfdom. So if people start thinking that the more empowered state is doing the bidding of the elite, trust in institutions is going to collapse. That's actually not a far-fetched thing for the US, for example. But it also needs to have the trust in the institutions from a broader segment of society so that they actually see that they are benefiting, and they are indeed benefiting from these. And in that, for example, the last 30 years have been quite a bit of a disappointment for Americans of many backgrounds, because they didn't really see those benefits. So, and then in fact, we'll talk about this in the discussion. I think this is not just about income, and that's why I think a lot of the redistribution calls are only part of the story. It's really much more about jobs and a perception that people are taking part in a meaningful, gainful employment experience. And so job creation is probably as important. And it also has some much more detailed implications about the form of redistribution, how and in what way you deal with technological change and so on, which I think are also issues that touch on what you wanted to talk about. So I'll just end there and we can take the discussion.
Great. This is wonderful, and I think it touches on sort of crosses paths with some of the discussions here the last 2 weeks in a number of different ways. I will turn to Roberto in a second, but while he's putting his mic on, can you say, Daron, just a little bit about what the relationship of this is to your the previous Why Nations Fail, and in particular the inclusive versus extractive institutions dichotomy, and why you felt like you needed to write this book?
Well, I didn't want to just retire.
You have the...
But I think, you know, I would say two major differences. One is that I don't think there is anything fundamentally different about what we are calling, what we call inclusive institutions, and this, as the bulwark of economic flourishing, economic growth, innovation in that book, and the implications of the shackled Leviathan. But what we are doing is twofold different. First, this is much more explicit about what the foundations of these types of institutions are, and in particular in highlighting not only that these institutions are about distribution of political power, enforcement of contracts, organization of markets, but also about the type of dynamic relationships between different segments of society with each other, and especially between different segments of society and the whole fabric of the state institutions. And in that sense, there also this perspective is quite a bit more dynamic, in the sense that the evolution of these institutions is critical in understanding how they function. So if this is in fact the picture, you cannot, you know, start creating a very high capacity state overnight. It's a process, and how do you actually manage that process is what a good chunk of the book is about.
So why don't we just have a couple of rounds amongst ourselves before opening up to questions? You want to?
Absolutely. So first, Daron, let me ask you a question of clarification. And that goes to this discussion with which you began about civil society as a countervailing power. And then I'd like to present a second set of questions about the extractive, non-extractive distinction in Why Nations Fail. So is the countervailing power about the political mobilization of civil society? Or is it about the organization of civil society outside the state to undertake certain responsibilities and assert a position that's distinct from the position of the state? Those two projects, although they don't contradict each other, have distinct agendas.
Should I talk about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, because once you say that, then I want to go on to my inquiry.
Yeah, I think it's much more about the first, and I see the second as a corollary. So if you look at the history of at least our rendition of the history, which is obviously through a particular set of lenses, at the early stages of being in the corridor, you have almost none of the second. You really have a struggle by segments of society to hang on to some ways of influencing the state and not letting the divine right of kings or rulers or whatever run amok. That second part, which is society shouldering its own sort of agenda setting through activities, pulling in different directions, that's what I refer to as like the cooperation of society. And that comes quite a bit later, perhaps. Although, if perhaps we knew much more about what was going on in Athens and among the Franks or in very early stages of non-Western civilizations more than 2,000 years ago, perhaps we'll see other aspects of that cooperation and the sort of activities of civil society outside of the state that's non-political.
But let me question you then about that. So the issue of the level of political mobilization bears on the question, do we have to choose between Madison and Mussolini? So conventional conservative political thinking supposes that there is a choice between a cold institutional politics and a hot anti-institutional or extra-institutional politics. The article you gave us about Trump, in a way, deals with that. But this assumption seems to be wrong, and that we can design political institutions that are hotter, that is, that elevate the level of organized engagement of the people in political life. And that has to do with the electoral regimes, with the relation of politics to money, and the relation of politics to the media. So that's one agenda.
That's right.
But that's not the classical agenda in which the idea of the countervailing power of civil society has characteristically been formulated. So I suppose that the classical roots of this are in thinkers like Montesquieu and Tocqueville, who had the idea that freedom is secure only when there are intermediate organizations between the individual and the state. And these organizations have a distinct basis and distinct responsibilities. Now, it seems to me that your vocabulary of countervailing power would suggest that you're interested in a democratic counterpart to that aristocratic idea. Because in Montesquieu, the example of this is the type of regime that he calls the monarchy. And in Tocqueville, it's actually the ancien regime, which according to him was in some ways freer than France after the revolution.
Yes.
So how is this to occur? And it seems that there are at least three sets of conditions. The first is that the state be democratized, democracy be democratized, and we have what I called a moment ago, a politics that is both hot and institutional. The second is that civil society have responsibility to do something that is not philanthropy, not lobbying, and not governmental politics. And that there be institutions that enable it to perform this function. So let me give you an example of what this might mean in a contemporary context. We don't want to choose between the bureaucratized provision of low-quality public services and the privatization of these services in favor of profit-driven firms. So we imagine that there's a third option. And the third option is that civil society will be organized so that it can participate together with the state, not for profit, through cooperatives, for example, in the competitive and experimental provision of public services. The state provides the floor of universal rudimentary services and operates at the ceiling of the most expensive, but in the broad middle area, it partners with civil society. Then civil society has a function. But now there's a third condition, which is that the inherited apparatus of private law seems insufficient as a template for this activity. So we actually need to organize it and give it legal expression and create a third kind of law in between private and public law, for example. Now, it seems to me that if we interpret your project in the broadest sense, it requires both of these agendas.
Oh, no, I didn't mean that. That what I was trying to say. I think you're broaching on many subjects, and some of them I probably don't have the expertise to comment on. But I didn't mean to say that. Well, this is what I'm using a much simpler terminology than
Yes.
you are. But this is I interpreted your question to mean contestation and cooperation. So what I was trying to say is that contestation of society's contestation of power comes before cooperation. And the second part of what you're saying, again, is perhaps is not exactly what I'm calling the cooperation, but this is sort of our interpretation of how the provision of public goods becomes much deeper in, say, starting in the 19th century in certain parts of the world, because society gets involved in providing some of these public goods, pushing the state or doing it itself. You actually start seeing that in England in the 16th century, by the way, but for it to become much more institutionalized is really in the 19th century. So I think for today, a well-functioning shackled Leviathan will need both the contestation and the cooperation. But the emphasis I was trying to put is that we see the contestation as key. Without the contestation, the cooperation won't work, because the cooperation will not be credible when all the power is in the hands of the state. And that contestation, and I hadn't thought about this cold versus hot, and your interpretation is I think quite consistent with what we're saying, is that you need the mobilization of society and their involvement in politics, which is not an orderly process. But to make it successful, you actually need to make it more orderly, and that's where the role of institutions comes. So the more institutionalized the power of society is, the better. So you can try to check a ruler through protests every time the ruler does something bad, but that's very hard. The collective action problem is quite formidable. You cannot control the protests. You cannot really choose their direction. So if instead you have civil society organizations, parliaments, and local elections, those are going to be a more institutionalized way of what you call the hot power to exhibit itself. But clearly, it's a very non-Madisonian, and in fact, a lot of the book is about sort of criticizing the Madisonian perspective.
In defense of the second agenda, I would say
The cooperation agenda.
I wouldn't call it the cooperation agenda. It's that civil society is self-organized outside the state, and it has things to do, and it has powers of its own. The countervailing power is a consequence of that accumulation of social capital. The countervailing power is the byproduct. It's not the immediate goal. So sometimes in this discussion, you've treated it as if the countervailing power were itself the object. But real countervailing power in history arises as the consequence of some accumulation of prerogative, of assets.
No, I don't disagree with that. So again, as you've probably guessed, this is not a very de Tocquevillian perspective in many ways, but we do not disagree with sort of the de Tocqueville's emphasis on sort of associational life being important and then having implications for politics, and then we sort of try to incorporate that. But
no, I wasn't defending a Tocquevillian perspective. What I was suggesting is that we lack a radical democratic counterpart to these ideas of people like Tocqueville and Montesquieu and so forth. And that's what seems to be required. And not to hang the idea of countervailing power solely on the project of political mobilization.
I see. It's interesting. I have to think about that. I have not completely sort of thought about it from those perspectives. But, you know, I guess the book does argue against an extremely simplified version of that view, which is definitely not yours, which is that, well, you don't need the state. So we, you know, a lot of the book is based on the argument that you do need the state, because many of the things that society actually needs, especially as related to the end of dominance in its many dimensions, really require state actions, requires centralized authority, centralized use of laws as a coordinating and as an enforcing device. And those are things that you're not going to be able to provide without the state. But then you need the state's powers to be highly controlled in some way. But you know, your sort of radical democracy point of how a non-de Tocquevillian version of society's organization and provision of goods, I have to think about that.
Danny, would you want to come in on this? Because I think we should have another discussion about the extractive, inclusive distinction.
That's tough. So let me step back here. So part of it is, you know, one thing is the content of that more radical democratic
Yes.
set of institutions. I think it would be useful to come to that in the context of the specific economic issues.
Yes.
Let's postpone this discussion
Yes.
for a little bit. But let me step back, having listened to both of you, and just to summarize some of it in terms that I can understand.
So there's my language, Roberto's language, which I have to translate to myself, and now Danny has to do his own.
Well, you have
Good
no
luck,
idea.
guys, in the exam.
You have, well, yeah, I know exactly what you feel like there on having, you know, sort of, brings me back to the first couple of years I was teaching with Roberto. So.
Did you have a dictionary ahead?
But so I'll simplify very much, but hopefully not. So there's a problem of how to ensure freedom, and there's the problem of how to ensure state effectiveness. And to put it very crudely, I think that whole sort of why nations fail and the dichotomy between inclusive and extractive institutions was really fundamentally about the question of how do you ensure freedom in a broad sense, both political, but as well as a state that provides sort of a modicum of property rights, contract enforcement, and allows economic freedom and therefore some economic flourishing at the same time. That was the heart of that book's agenda. What I take here to be really new and building on that is this notion that we have to go to the next step, is how do you then make a state effective? How do you solve the problem of ensuring state effectiveness, given that the state has to produce now a lot of things? You gave the example of the Beveridge report, the welfare state, and responding to sort of these sort of 20th century challenges of economic security. So one question, again, which we postponed, what we should be coming back to is what is the 21st century equivalent of the Beveridge report, or the 21st century equivalent of the welfare state in light of these technological problems and jobs problems. But the first agenda was really the how to ensure freedom was really conceptualize the state, and that was sort of like maybe one criticism of why nations fail would have been that it's a really very negative view of the state, that the state is there just to basically, it has to be there because you need property rights and contract enforcement, but the state is there not to screw things up, basically. Whereas the second agenda is now using the state as sort of, as an effective agent in some kind of alliance cooperation with civil society and societal organizations to achieve a kind of a transformative function. So I don't know if you really meant it, but the way you presented it is almost like a historical sequence. So you have to have the shackled, the freedom problem solved first before you can move on to the effectiveness problem. And of course, so that immediately makes me think about whether there are other paths. So the Chinese path, for example, you might imagine, which I don't know what you call maybe the red dragon example versus the red queen problem, which is that you actually build an effective state that in some sense is responding to many of the demands of society, at least is delivering economic goodies for quite some time. And therefore, might that actually sort of be a way of blunting the demand for freedom in some ways? So, that is, and we may not necessarily like it because we think it's missing something. But sort of first question is, did you necessarily mean that this is a historical necessity that you have to go through this in a particular sequence? Sort of how do we fit China into this? A lot of students who comment on the work that I read their response papers for before coming here. So the two countries, actually three countries that were constantly brought up, where one is China. Well, how does China really fit in? Second was India, which is, well, look, India looks like it's a country that has inclusive institutions, long-term democracy for much of this, except for the last couple of decades, it hasn't really done well. And then the third country was Brazil, which is, at the time you wrote Why Nations Fail, you might have pointed to Brazil as a successful example.
More than might have.
Yeah, right. And then now sort of...
We've learned our lesson. We don't talk about Brazil in this book.
So let's bring down maybe, I think one way to continue sort of the institutional discussion might be to bring it a little bit to the concrete realities of, let's say, these three cases, if you can say a little bit more.
Yeah.
Until we run out of things to talk about. Until 3.
3. I'm not sure my voice is gonna go all that much.
Okay, and then
We'll
okay.
deal with that. So those are excellent points, and you've summarized everything extremely well. But the one thing that I didn't mean to say, if I did imply it, that freedom somehow comes first. But balance of power comes first. So in other words, if you look at Western Europe, which is parts of it, like England, are prime examples of countries that have moved into the corridor and have evolved in there, you wouldn't see much liberty during many centuries there. But what you see is much more of a balance of power. So even during very tumultuous periods, going back to the sort of the Carolingians or the Merovingian empires, you have a much greater balance of power coming back partly to the assembly politics that was at the root of some of these states. But certainly freedom over time evolves, and there are several barriers on the way of that freedom to evolve. One is violence. Bringing violence under control is definitely a process. The second is state's power. As soon as you build a state, when the institutions are not up to the task, even if you have a tradition of assemblies, tradition of consultation, and so on and so forth, without the real institutions to back that up, that's not going to be completely effective. And the third is what we call the cage of norms. Many of these societies have various different ways of norm-based conflict resolution that at the end robs people a lot of their choices. And all three of these sort of evolve over time. And one of the functions of the state, so you very rightly put your finger on, this is a much more proactive state sort of thesis, but one of the functions of the state, and this is where one of the the most complex part of our theories in some sense, is that the state has a critical role in changing the norms, while at the same time building on existing norms. So what I mean by that is that, if you think of the nature of law, and here I'm definitely saying things I shouldn't say with a room full of lawyers, but the way that I think one view of the law is, very much this would be consistent with how, for example, law is viewed in legalism in China, is that the law is the rules set by the emperor, the ruler, the state. But our reading of the history is that in almost all of the cases that you have societies move into the corridor, the law starts as a codification of existing norms and then centralization of their monitoring, implementation, and coordination. And then slowly the state working with existing norms, changing how those rules are implemented, and at the margin start to change the laws. So for instance, again, people here would know much better, going back to, Solon's laws in ancient Athens, or Clovis's Salic laws, or King Alfred's law code. Many of the things that they're doing, they're reaffirming existing norms, and then to some degree bringing this greater degree of centralization. But, and that's where the complication comes, it's not just replicating the existing norm, because many of these norms are actually very restrictive of both political, social, and economic freedoms. So over time, you have the state, as part of its own evolutionary process, bringing down some aspects of the norms that either sort of stand in the way of political participation. That was actually one of the big projects of both Solon and Cleisthenes in ancient Athens, is that they wanted to change the norms in order to get people to participate in politics. And also at the same time, get rid of non-state, non-centralized, norm-based ways of conflict resolution, which are incompatible with what the state wants to do. And that often is very relevant for economic sort of incentives and opportunities to become more broadly based. So in that sense, in the previous book, in Why Nations Fail, we probably pissed off everybody who was very favorable to China. In this book, we'll piss off more people. So in addition to China, we have a very negative take on India. And our negative take on India is based in considering India not as an example of a society that is that has sort of built inclusive institutions, but on the contrary, it has failed to build inclusive institutions because norms have trumped state institutions. So we view, again, this is simplistic, obviously reality is much more complex, but at a high level, state institutions have very much been shaped by caste relations, and caste relations have played a double role in India in our reading. One is that they have changed the way in which the state functions, but secondly, they have also fragmented and discombobulated society so that it doesn't have that organizational capacity to either contest power or cooperate power. So as a result, India is very far from, the corridor in this sense. What about China? So I think in terms of China, even though your interpretation of, unique path from freedom to state capacity wasn't what I meant, the pessimism about China was exactly what I meant. And the reason is, again, on this picture. This is supposed to be a dynamic picture. The further you travel here, the harder for you to get back. So if the story of China, especially starting from the Warring States period and the Qin dynasty, is a despotic state imposition and weakening society, it's going to be very difficult to move back into the corridor. And that is very much sort of because of the coevolution of the norms and institutions that sort of sustain different sort of political participation and different type of political activities. In terms of Brazil, I'm going to let Roberto take that one.
Should we take a few questions?
Sure, but let's reserve time for the discussion of the book.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
extractive, non-extractive.
You want to get
And so
back to that?
I do.
Okay. So let's take.
And also, you wanted to talk about technology.
Yes, I do. I want to talk about that because that's.
But that's
So what does the effective state to do in that area? So what's
So that was I was sort of anticipating that in my last slide by saying we first need to diagnose the problem, right? I think that there's a lot of problem there because I think, for those of you who don't know, half of my time is spent on thinking about technology and automation, and the other half on these types of things. And my take there is actually that there's a lot of incorrect diagnosis of the problem in that respect. So that's relevant.
So I think it would be useful given some time for that.
of course.
But
There's a tie-in.
Is there
there's a
somewhere
bridge.
where I can get like a plastic cup and get some water downstairs from the restroom, or is there? I can't
someone
even
help
find
us?
it.
I think Mohamed will do that for us.
I am
Thank
so
you.
sorry. You were.
No, but he's not well.
Yeah.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you. I'm so
Thank
sorry.
you.
Thanks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. We're really working you hard, Daron. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's just I didn't drink any water for more than an hour, and then my throat is very dry. So
Questions and comments on so far on the discussion that we've had that's sort of germane to what we've already discussed. Yeah.
Bruno.
So my question is, do you also take into account, because some constitutional systems, especially like in Latin America and the global south, have these structures where the judiciaries are getting more and more power, like in terms of exercising like and enforceability of economic, social, and cultural rights. So if civil society has like sort of like this direct access to the judiciary and then are like granting those rights in response to these claims, so are you also taking into account that? Where does it fit in your model?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that because this is something we've thought a little bit about, and then we decided it was beyond what we could manage. Because the problem with the judiciary is that it's not clear how society influences the judiciary in many settings. You know, in the Middle Ages, it was very clear because the common law is really law implemented by the people. So if you go to the 14th, 15th century England, you know, there's no way of implementing the law if you're a king other than asking for people's society's cooperation. So in that sense, law is very much part of that cooperation with society if it's going to function in states like that. But today, that's completely changed. So you have a Supreme Court in the US. You know, how does society influence the Supreme Court? It's not very clear. It will depend on the ethos of the Supreme Court. It will depend on the pressures on senators of who they're going to appoint. And once the Supreme Court has been appointed, are they going to completely follow their agenda or not? So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So you have examples of the Supreme Court. You know, as for example, during FDR, you know, trying to stop reforms. You have examples of the Supreme Court just during the Warren Court of running ahead of politicians. But we don't have a good theory of when one is likely to happen versus not. I think at a very high level, of course, the courts are influenced by public pressure. You know, I think, you know, in the issue of gay marriage, for example, it was really the public that, you know, pushed everything else. But it's a very weak causal channel in some sense. Please?
Sorry, you take it.
I wanted to ask you to give some very specific examples of these institutions because I feel often it's like very vague to me. And maybe not the totally extreme ones of like, you know, outright looting or like farmer expropriation. I think
Louder, please.
yeah, it would just be great to give some very concrete examples of like extractive institutions sort of contrasted by inclusive institutions, and maybe not the totally extreme cases, but more sort of realistic ones.
Well, I don't know what you mean by extreme, so it's hard to know. But let me just give you one example, which, you know, both is relevant for extractive institutions and this, which is, you know, how state bureaucracy works. So if you look at the way that, you know, many bureaucracies in developing countries work, is that they are completely unresponsive to the needs of the people. There are several interesting ethnographic studies, you know, from, for example, one from Argentina, which, you know, looks at people sort of queuing outside the system. They're not given appointments. They're sent from one office to the other. There is complete unhelpfulness. The services that they're supposed to get, in this case, welfare payments, they cannot get. And then when you look at the origins of that system, well, where is it? Well, there's certainly no oversight of the system. But more importantly, you know, almost everybody who is in the system is political appointments. The same thing you see day in and day out. And then you compare that with the reform. Well, reform often takes the form of both who is appointed changes, the appointments channels change, oversight changes, the objectives change, and therefore, as a result, services change. So one interesting example comes from, for example, Lagos, which is a classic case. You know, you have a tax bureaucracy of the Lagos state of 14,000 people at some point, and there are only about 15 people who are qualified tax accountants or any sort of expertise, and the state has got a huge budget deficit. And then a process of reform starts, and as part of that reform, the first thing that they do actually is stop the political appointments. So you have actually much greater human capital. So the bureaucracy is now able to actually perform its functions. So it starts with some privatization in this instance, doing some record keeping about who is supposed to pay taxes. Within the course of about 3 years, tax revenues skyrocket. So now the state can actually raise the taxes and start using those taxes to provide public services. So again, this is a very specific thing, and you see both sort of the effectiveness angle, which Danny was sort of rightly identifying, but also the origins of these things. But you can give exactly the same type of examples when it comes to property rights enforcement, contract enforcement, specific expertise in the area of regulation. When you look at regulation in many Latin American countries, it's complete shambles. Again, both the incentives and the expertise in the state bureaucracy that's supposed to do the regulation is completely missing. So roads don't get built, electricity doesn't get provided, licenses don't get issued. So those type of things are, again, the sort of the more micro institutional details that matter greatly.
I just want to follow up. So I'm not quite sure how it is an extractive institution when you're not actually extracting tax money.
Well, you are extracting because the people who make those appointments do that for political reasons, and then once they have the political power, they are able to use that political power for extracting resources, either for their own pet projects or for their own pocket, whatever that is. So extraction here doesn't literally mean you're extracting things from the ground. It's more sort of euphemistic that you are using the resources in the inefficient ways because of your control of political power.
Maybe one more question, maybe before we move to Roberto. Yeah.
I'm not sure how every type of power of society would be compatible with this Shackle-Leviathan idea. Like mass mobilization, liberal associations such as the US and UK are very different phenomena, like mass mobilization in developing countries. And I'm not sure how Praetorian democracy or populism would lead to the same economic performance we'll say that this Shackle-Leviathan would have. How does your theory fit in mass mobilization at this point?
Yeah, I think mass mobilization, one has to be careful about what we mean. By societal mobilization, I mean societies taking part in politics through various types of channels. And that doesn't necessarily mean populism. So populism has sometimes played that role. I think Danny wrote an article about 2 or 3 years ago. Was that, didn't you write something that said good populism, bad populism?
Something like that.
Something like that. Simplifying it a little bit.
I said economic populism can be good sometimes.
I see. Okay. So I think what we commonly associate with populism today, because that's the one that is of immediate alarming danger to many democracies, is a type of mass mobilization that is very polarizing and intends to decimate institutions rather than work with them. So I think that's what, when I was referring to the zero-sum Red Queen, that's what I was trying to capture, and we're much more detailed on that in the book. So again, let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean, like Chavez-type populism, not to mention what we have at home, but say versus another. So take the civil rights movement. Okay, so I think if anybody had any legitimate claim that institutions were rigged and there was a conspiracy against them and that they've suffered from this conspiracy with the elites and others' complicity, that was of course African Americans. But when the civil rights movements became mobilized, they did not say we're going to decimate all institutions, we reject all institutions, we're going to dispossess non-African Americans. They actually very much worked with the institutions. The whole sort of civil rights movements, from the Children's Crusade to the Basque protests and Freedom Riders, were about forcing the court system to take action. And when you compare that to sort of the Venezuelan Bolivarian revolution, that's very, very different. So that's part of the thing of versus zero-sum versus non-zero-sum Red Queen. please. But let me just say one other thing. Sorry, I didn't want to. But what I want to say is that I also don't think that if you think of the liberal, you mentioned liberal democracy or some such thing, that that's an alternative to mobilization that really coexists with mobilization. So take away people's protests, petitioning, complaining, and other ways of pressuring politicians and the media, and the liberal democracy will completely collapse in its effectiveness.
Okay. So maybe I'm hoping we'll have another round, but let's.
Daron, let me ask this question, which may serve as a bridge to the discussion of the knowledge economy and this dilemma of development that Danny referred to. What is the programmatic message of this body of work? Is the programmatic message that there already exists in the world, in the most advanced countries, a body of institutions, economic and political, that we can take as an example of the non-extractive? So your work is prodigal in third world developing country examples. And it sometimes seems that the message is that the way is already manifest in the rich North Atlantic world. Is that the message? Or is the message that the non-extractive institutions don't yet exist and that we would have to imagine and create them?
I will say three answers.
Yes.
First, non-extractive institutions are always a work in progress. And that's actually, again, another thing that wasn't clear in Why Nations Fail, though probably if you had asked me at the time, I would have said it, though I probably didn't ask myself. Because the challenges are changing completely. So even if, pick your favorite country, Denmark, UK, France, Germany, had perfect institutions in 1980, they won't have perfect institutions in 2020. Because the challenges, the balances, the threats are all changing. So you have to keep up with them. And that's what the sort of the more dynamic picture is supposed to communicate. Second, and this is where I completely depart from Danny, I think this is the only place so far, where I completely believe that what you need to achieve is common. So in terms of this picture, it's a balance of power. There isn't a different Chinese path to having liberty. There isn't a different Indian path. The path always have to have the same balance of power, the same relaxation of norms, the same ability of the state ultimately to start to be the arbiter of disputes. But, and that's the third thing, the way each country gets there is extremely different. So even though the way in which we can create the institutional and social foundations of economic, social, and political liberty have a lot of commonality, the way that you're going to get there from Saudi Arabia is very different from the way that you're going to get from the US, or the way you're going to get from to there for Brazil. And that is, again, part of the parcel of this in progress thing. You know, if you look at the countries that we would say in the shackled Leviathan, some of them resolve some of the problems much earlier and others much later. So the US, I think despite all of our collective complaints about the US, and there are many well-deserved ones, is still a sort of a shackled Leviathan, but it hasn't brought violence under control. There's endemic violence in many parts of the US, even with the precipitous drop in murder rates over the last 20 years. It has not created equal opportunities for many of its citizens. It has not ended discrimination against perhaps 20% of the population. and it has not controlled the way in which economic elites are able to influence politics. On the other hand, you look at Switzerland. Switzerland has done many of these things much earlier than the US, but the political empowerment of women, a crucial part of any sort of reasonable definition of liberty, that was much delayed in Switzerland relative to the US or the UK or France. So countries get there in their own different ways, but where they're heading, if they're going to really create these conditions for liberty, have a lot of commonality.
So I'll answer my own question.
Please do.
And see what.
Let me pose your question.
What you and Daron, what you and Danny think of this. So I would defend the thesis that we don't know what the non-extractive institutions are in the conditions of today. They don't exist. They are to be created. And
Yeah, that's not so different from what I was saying.
that half and half. So let's take the example of the knowledge economy that we've been discussing here. When there's a wave of innovations in the world, organizational and technological, the most common result is to adopt the innovations in the manner that least disturbs the established interests and the dominant ideas. And we could call that the path of least resistance. So the confined form of the knowledge economy could be seen as an instance of this path of least resistance, because the creation of an inclusive knowledge economy might require much more radical institutional and educational innovation.
So far, completely agree.
Okay, so, but that leads in a different direction. So then the programmatic message is not that if only we got rid of these perversions that exist in the third world and followed the institutional model of the North Atlantic societies, we would be on the route to non-extraction.
You guys are
inclusive.
agreeing. You guys,
Yes.
Roberto, you agree. You guys are agreeing.
But,
It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
yes,
Okay.
but then there's the content, which is the issue you
Okay, so-
raised.
exactly. So, but let's the content. On the content, I think we first have to define the challenge
Yes.
in ways that I think, let's hear the way that Daron puts the challenge, because he teased us by saying that it's not what everybody thinks, and that everybody might
Yeah.
do thus.
Okay. On technology or more broadly?
Yeah. So I mean, just to and if your throat is really getting
No,
bad,
it's fine.
let us
No,
know.
I have
So-
water now.
So the content question about sort of what is there's a fair amount of agreement, surprisingly perhaps, that that we need a new set of institutions that probably don't exist anywhere else. That these won't necessarily arise on their own because of the path of least resistance problem and the problem of established interests. So that's all fine, but to figure out what those institutions look like, we have to define the challenge that the knowledge economy or these new technologies pose for jobs and labor markets and for inclusion more broadly. And I thought I heard you say that first need to understand the
Yeah.
nature of the problem before we go to institutional solutions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'll say, because I don't want to take too much on that, but I think in my thinking, the nature of the problem is that we have entered a phase where, in contrast to the past, it's not that we have, what the difference with the past isn't that we have a wave of technologies that are disruptive, that are replacing workers, and so on. It is that we have entered a phase where this is ongoing at the same time as productivity growth is extremely limited, and we are not doing other things that would be a great driver of employment creation. So just for comparison, again, to make things a little concrete, if you look at what robots, for example, or numerically controlled machinery do, in many ways they're very similar to what mechanized agriculture did 100 years ago. So what mechanized agriculture did is it took tasks that were performed by labor, or very heavily labor-intensive tasks, and then mechanized them so that you could do them with machines and the labor wasn't necessary to perform them. What was the implication of that? Well, the implication of that in agriculture was that the labor share of agriculture plummeted. Our agriculture used to be very heavily labor-intensive and gradually ceased to be so. That's exactly what you expect when you have automation, which is capital being substituted for labor. And people started leaving agriculture. So any dream that, we've mechanized agriculture, therefore we're going to create many more agricultural jobs, that's not a reality, that's just a dream. But what happened at the same time in the US economy is that through some sort of fortuitous balance, or I don't, we can talk about why that happened, but there were a series of new occupations and new industries that boomed exactly around the same time. So these were clerical occupations, white-collar occupations, both in services and manufacturing. Actually, manufacturing became very non-production worker intensive around that time with all the back office functions. New manufacturing industries came up. Many service occupations started expanding. And this happened in the background of, for example, something like the high school movement in the US, where, and in other countries perhaps it had a different name, but there was enough of the skill supply for people to fill these jobs which required a different sorts of skills. So what you look at robots today, they're doing exactly the same thing. In places where you have the robots, labor share plummets, employment just like in agriculture falls. But the other industries that should be doing the picking up the slack and employing these people, especially at relatively good wages, those are absent. So that's number one. Number two then, why on earth is this difference? And then number three is what we can do about it. So I can talk about those two, or we can sort of talk about number one first and then come to the next two. I don't know which one's better.
No, that's fine, but we probably want to make sure we have enough time for number three.
Right.
So that maybe we should.
So maybe we should start with 3.
Let's start with three. So
Well, I don't think I can start with three until I'll be extremely brief on number two.
okay.
So the answer on number two is I don't know. I'm very brief. No, I'm kidding. Seriously, look, what I've just described on number one is very much based on my own research, and nothing is perfect, but this is backed up with empirical evidence. What I'm going to say on number two is speculation, because I don't have the right empirical design to be able to do it. But there are essentially two answers out there that could be. One is that the nature of technology has changed such that we could not have the modern equivalent of the white-collar jobs and the new industries coming up. We're technologically only capable of doing automation and nothing else. The second bucket is, no, the second possibility is open, but there are a range of failures that are not letting us do that. I believe the second, but I don't have, smoking gun evidence, just circumstantial evidence. And the second would be a failure of several layers. First is a failure of innovation. So I think the energy of the innovative sector in the US and in other countries is misdirected. And in fact, the reason why we don't have productivity growth in this country, or very anemic productivity growth, is related to that. It's a distortion of the allocation of innovation research and new ideas. Why? There are some governmental reasons and there's some social reasons. For example, the ethos of automation, that the right thing to do is get the fallible human factor out of the production equation, just excitement about AI and big machines and big data and so on and so forth, that actually is distorting some of that. The second is about complementary social activities that are necessary for innovation. So if you chalked off the high school movement in the early 20th century, the transition of the next generation of workers into white-collar jobs would have been much harder because they wouldn't have the right skills. So this, I think Roberto was already hinting at that. So you really need a radical rethink of the educational system. And in fact, it's high time for it because the educational system was already failing even without the rethink, because it was, all of the inequities of the American system were deeply ingrained in the educational system, and that created a way for the system to inequality and inefficiency to replicate itself, to reinforce itself. And I think it's high time that you can try to tackle that while at the same time you also have a way of dealing with it. And then the third is, I think there are more parochial things like tax policy. We actually have a tax policy at the moment that subsidizes people to use machines even when it's not economically efficient. So we tax labor, we subsidize capital. So there are a bunch of more boring reasons for this sort of possibility. Third, what can be done about it? Well, if I didn't know the answer to the second, this one I don't know double. So So I think I can talk about generalities. I think generalities is because I think, give me omniscience and omnipotence and I can do it. But that's not the way things get done. I think the third question is really about what sort of political coalitions you can form and what would be feasible given those political coalitions. And I think that's why sort of identifying the answers to the first two is critical, because once you identify those answers, you can think about what a reasonable coalition could be possible. And then also the other thing, and again, this is my interpretation of the Swedish experience, is that a lot of these coalitions are about institutional innovation. I think before the SAP leaders like Branting and Hansen sort of thought of doing a different type of social democratic politics, nobody had thought of it. And nobody had thought that you could start having a coalition between farmers and workers who were diametrically opposed to each other, and that you could actually bring the business interests into it. So you have to come up with ways of experimenting and finding common grounds, identifying new problems. Great Depression was such a problem. Inequality, the economy sliding, and strike activities that had increased tremendously in Sweden in the 1930s, bringing them under control while at the same time, keeping the recovery going. Those were all problems that people could agree. So once you find problems that you can agree on, that helps. I think there are some hopes in many countries in the West, not to mention the developing world, where I think the challenges are a little different, though some commonalities. The problems of jobs, the problems of inequality, the problems of government policy not being effective, I think are things that the traditional left and the traditional right somehow agree, although even if the solutions that they come up with are different. But I think ways of finding those coalitions, I think, is important. And if you can do that, I think the three major legs of policy would be corresponding to the three things that I mentioned: fixed tax policy, support the right type of education as a complementary device, not sort of a utopian view of education. We educate everybody and we get everything good. No, it's not. You have to find what are the skills that are going to be demanded. What's the way of providing the full suite of skills in the right way to the population. And then third is and this is very important in my opinion, you need to have much more on redirecting technological change.
But what's your basic understanding of this paradoxical combination of technological and organizational revolution with productivity slowdown?
I think my understanding is exactly that, if you go back to the first 30 years of the 20th century, and you look at agriculture, you'll see a bewildering array of new technologies, and you'll be very impressed, and you can call it technological revolution, and if you say that these machines come from some whiz kits, you'll be very excited about them. But take away all the rest that was being done in the economy, you would have very disappointing productivity growth.
Of course.
So the fundamental issue is that agriculture was, as it was becoming so productive, the labor that was being displaced from agriculture was ending up in other occupations in urban areas where they were also very productive.
Exactly.
Whereas today,
in fact, they were becoming more productive. That's
was, if anything, more productive. Whereas today, the labor that is displaced from the most advanced sectors of the economy essentially ending up in the proverbial low productivity service
exactly.
jobs.
Or nowhere. Or nowhere.
Or nowhere. And I think that's so. The answer to sometimes. So one way of answering the question, why do we have so much innovation but so little productivity in the economy as a whole? One answer that we've given here in the past has been, well, if those innovations aren't being disseminated throughout the rest
Yes.
of the economy, then of course they're going to remain somewhat
Yes.
bottled up. And so for the same reason that what drove productivity during the agricultural transition era wasn't what was happening in agriculture per se, it was happening in the rest of the economy. Today we need increases in productivity not in the most advanced firms and sectors that already exist, but somehow sort of disseminating through the rest. But so, but the rest are sort of a kind of a disparate kind of services, essentially. And it's very difficult to see how, some of the mechanisms that worked in the past. For example, sometimes I think that the answer today is a kind of a 21st century equivalent of sort of extension services for manufacturing or advanced sectors to disseminate it to their suppliers in the same way that agricultural extension in the 19th century in the United States was able to disseminate the most advanced agricultural techniques to smaller farmers and in the outlying areas. So maybe the model is, one model for these new industrial policies is a kind of a manufacturing extension in the same way as agricultural extension work. But I'm not so sure that really solves this problem that I think Daron identifies, which is, sort of where do people end up, if indeed we're condemned for these sectors because they're so capital and skill intensive that, they will have less and less demand for the relatively less skilled part of the workforce. You need to find demand for this less skilled workforce at good wages and high productivity elsewhere in the economy, and that's not where we're seeing, and that's where I think we're hitting a kind of a wall.
But there are two answers, right? They don't contradict each other, but they're distinct. One answer is the advanced economy, the knowledge economy, is disseminated economy-wide and reinvented or adapted to the circumstances of each part of the production system. But the other answer is no, the knowledge economy is appropriate to only some parts of the production system, and in other parts, other ways, other paradigms of production are invented, not like the knowledge economy, to elevate the level of productivity in them. In principle, it has seemed that the first answer is the more promising and plausible.
Yeah, if I can say, I'm never comfortable with the term knowledge economy because I don't really know what its boundaries are. But technology in every field is critical, but it will be used differently.
Yes.
So there is no service today that is being provided, even the most menial custodial services, that's not affected by technology. But the way that technology is playing a role is going to be very different, and so you have to find the right ways of doing it. I think one of the things that, in fact, I think both of you are saying, and let me sort of just underscore, we haven't found ways of using artificial intelligence or any of the other software, recent software breakthroughs to make labor-intensive services more productive. Education, healthcare have not really been affected fundamentally by any of these technologies. And whether they will be and in what way they will be, I think that's part of the it's not the only part, but it's part of the question of where some of these jobs may come from. But obviously, healthcare and education are still at the high end of the skill requirements, and for the lower end, it's even different.
Well, you're right. It's hard to have the discussion because we haven't defined the knowledge economy. But the assumption of our conversation has been it's not just a set of technologies, it's a set of practices. And it's these practices together with the technologies that are highly confined in the existing economies.
Something else that Daron said that I think is worth emphasizing is that we shouldn't take, and I think it's also implicit in what you're saying, Roberto, that we shouldn't take the nature of this technology as essentially given.
Of course not.
What we're observing is that it's largely labor replacing and skill demanding, but that this might be in part a response to the incentives in the innovation system that exists currently, whether it's through the tax system, whether it's through the kind of innovation that the government directly...
And not just to incentives, but to the control of assets, of who controls, who commands.
So let me give you one example just to underscore all of these things. It's a completely speculative example, so it's more like a philosopher's example than an economist's example. So imagine that
So it's
you know,
not fact-based.
It's not fact-based. Imagine that we're thinking of a new AI technology for education. What would it be? And I think most people immediately would think, because that's the way we've been conditioned by what we have observed about AI, what we've read about AI, that the new AI technology for education would be something that replaces teachers and you do better education with less teachers. But let me give you another vision. Another vision, which I think is much more realistic in principle, but not feasible at the moment, is that you actually use AI technology to have much more individualized teaching, which would require more teaching resources, more money spent, much more equitable, because then students are not left behind. You can cater things to their teaching demands, and then you can do real-time data collection about what things students are finding difficult, and you can adjust the curriculum depending on individual or groups of students' needs. But this would require three things that we currently don't have. First of all, it would require innovation in this domain. There are a few companies that work on some things like this, but extremely marginal. There's no big company that works on something like this. It require much more resources. This is precisely like the example that Danny and I was giving, like the new occupations. Is creating employment. Creating employment for teachers means that somebody has to hire these teachers, so more money for teachers. And then third, the teachers would need to have very different skills than the current teachers. The current teachers, they're trying to deal with 20 students and teaching to the class. Now you would have teachers that have to work with this technology and understand the needs of specific groups of students, requires different types of empathy skills, social skills, communication skills, numeracy skills. But all three of those things could be argued to be missing at the moment. So how do you get there? So that's the sort of the complementary nature.
But it's a very general principle in your example. The principle is the combination of the creative and the formulaic. The machine does the formulaic together with the non-machine, who's the person.
That's right.
And that's in every part of the production system in principle.
In principle, but a lot of the robotics, for example, hasn't been of that sort.
Yes.
Or we could imagine artificial intelligence systems or information systems that enable physicians' aides or nurses to do
Exactly, that's the other example.
a lot of the work that physicians do.
Exactly.
Then, of course, then the question about sort of the incentive systems, how the medical profession is organized, licensing, and all of these things are obviously part of the obstacle there. Or blasphemy, we could imagine sort of legal aids doing lawyers.
That's coming.
A lot of that is taking place.
Yes.
Comments, questions? Elena? Can you speak up so the people in the back can hear as well?
Yes, that I was also thinking from the discussion from before, that if the state is not doing it, how do you get people to mobilize about, for example, this, that is like how to tackle mechanization and all of these things, which seen with today's eyes, it seems like few people will benefit at first because the rest are still in these type of activities, like these activities, or also other things like that are actually a problem in the future, like climate change, or when you're living beyond your means, and that will be a problem later. Like if the government doesn't have incentives to tackle this, then people.
So this is actually a great question, because it goes back to the discussion that Roberto and I had at the beginning. I think, you've put your finger on things like climate change or dealing with nuclear waste or regulation of the economy, that are activities that require a very high degree of expertise. So it's, again, you could try to find substitutes for them, where society in a decentralized way, or what economists would call the private provision of public goods ways, you could try to deal with them. But it won't be very successful. You cannot deal with nuclear waste in a private provision of public goods ways, and you cannot do bureaucratic expertise and efficiency in that way. So the only way that's possible is that you will actually have to use society's mobilization to force the state to do it. And again, the reason why I picked on that example of bureaucratic inefficiency in places like Lagos or Buenos Aires or Bogota is because that's a sort of a more parochial version of that. But you cannot fix that just the private sector by doing it itself, even though a lot of people suffer as a result of it. And the examples of it that we have it fixed, you know, in the US during the age of machine politics to some degree, in the UK in the 19th century with the meritocratic structure of the civil service coming, or in places like Lagos or Bogota during certain windows, is that, you know, there's a process of political change that brings together both sort of society's mobilization and a commitment to improving public services. And at the local level, that seems to work quite well, although at the national level, recently there are fewer examples of that. And then that opens the discussion to another thing, which is, you know, in the 21st century, if you like to use that language, do we need to find a new way of sort of building up from local change to national change? Because I think some of these same problems are present at the local level, not climate change, obviously, not nuclear waste management, but some of them are present, and we have more examples of them being proactively tackled at the local level.
Many developing countries are carrying out large-scale industrial policies, and which requires a sort of strong state. So, do you think that it's hard to deal with this dilemma where you have to, to industrialize, you have to go beyond the corridor, and you may never come back in the middle?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, the simplest conceptualization of industrial policy, like General Park or the Chinese Communist Party, is not quite consistent with a balance between state and society. It gives a lot of power to the state. On the other hand, you know, the state playing a role in subsidizing certain activities, that's completely consistent. So how do you find the right way? Again, let me give you a couple of examples. You know, green technology, do you call that industrial policy or not? I don't care. But I'm completely convinced that that is absolutely essential. So any reasonable global policy has to include a huge amount of emphasis on green innovation, because you're not going to be able to solve the problem of climate, fossil fuel, without actually moving away from production technologies that use fossil fuel. But I don't think that that necessitates society to lose all of its ability to monitor the state's action. So it doesn't require General Park style, this is what I say, the sector you're going to go in, but it requires subsidies, regulations, taxes, inducements of various different sorts. Innovation. I think any reasonable economic model would include support for R&D, and that support for R&D need not be equal for different types of R&D. But again, how do we set up the right monitoring mechanism for society and the right expertise and choices? So actually the amazing thing is that if you look at a country like the US, which doesn't do bureaucracy as well as some European countries, you know, the amount of expertise in all of these areas that had accumulated until recently is kind of pretty amazing. You know, if you look at every part of the US state bureaucracy, there are hugely, especially, you know, until perhaps the 2000s where everybody started going into hedge funds, but the amount of high human capital people who entered that bureaucracy and gained a lot of expertise and were somehow responsive to the needs of society and the demands from politicians that were somehow synthesized with the needs of society, that was pretty amazing. Now, but we also know it's a fragile system. You know, it only takes one administration or perhaps two to reverse it. So there are some fragilities in that, but I think there are ways of doing sort of around the edges, taxes, subsidies, inducements, regulations, call it industrial policy, that are quite useful, that some Western societies have done and some developing countries have done quite successfully. But again, state capacity is key. You know, every example of industrial policy in the hands of you know, low capacity states like Ghana or Nigeria or Argentina, you know, have not just been despotic, but have been a complete disaster.
But I think part of the answer to your question, which Daron implies, is a change in the methods of public administration, right? Because what we have broadly in the world, and is clearly illustrated in the provision of public services, is what you could call an administrative Fordism. So it's the administrative counterpart to Fordist mass production, the bureaucratized provision of standardized low-quality services by universal rules that change all at once or not at all. And what would be necessary to have would be a framework of organized, monitored experimentation in which the state could try things out and find how they work before committing itself to a more universal solution. And that would be in the spirit of this new style of production. It would have to have as a counterpart a different form of education. It was analytical and dialectical. And it would have to have as a setting a different form of politics. A politics with a high temperature, a high level of popular engagement, with constitutional mechanisms for the rapid resolution of impasse through anticipated elections, for example, and a way of permitting that parts of a country, whether federal or unitary, diverge from the central solutions and try out counter models of the national future. And then yet another element in this institutional alternative would be the idea of a civil society that is strongly organized outside the state, not just to cooperate with the state, but to do things that the state does not do. And though all of those elements together then form the outline of another institutional direction, and they give content to the idea of a non-extractive alternative. It's not what exists yet. It's what has to be built, which is, I think, the best interpretation of your thesis.
So following up on Daron, what's your view on this experimentation? That you know, that if we're going to move forward, you know, that there will have to be a lot of experimentation in policy and institutional form in practices that is both across nations and also subnationally as well. And one of the debates that we've had in the past is, although I do favor institutional experimentation, that there is a certain amount of economic cost that might be associated with that in terms of transactions costs and in terms of limiting the scope of the market as these jurisdictional boundaries become more severe. So do you have any views?
I think there are two kinds of experimentation that are being discussed at here by you and Roberto, and perhaps we should distinguish them. One is, you know, let's take the U.S. just for simplicity. The federal state could do experimentation. So that would be essentially the model of experimentation as we have in economic textbooks. You know, I am a decision maker, and I do different things to see which one has better returns, and then I can build on it. So I think generally that's a good idea. The catch is that typically it's much harder than that because every action builds its own constituency. So what makes experimentation valuable is that you flexibly switch from one to the other, and then once you start building schools of one type as an experiment, and that schools become your constituency, then that completely undermines the point of experimentation in the first place. But as long as those political economy problems can be overcome, I think that's a great idea. The second, which I think is more important, is local experimentation, where the experiment is not just about what works, that's part of it, but it's also about political solutions, where what you're experimenting with is building the right coalitions and what would work and what will the public want. It's not the technocratic experimentation, but it's the political economy experimentation. And what I think creates room for it is that there is much less fear by the strongest national leaders of their power being threatened when that experimentation takes place at the local level. So you see, you have that, local experimentation going on in Lagos, while at the same time the Nigeria, was still highly corrupt at the state level. The military dictatorship was just collapsing, or just has collapsed, but nothing had come to its place. There was a lot of instability. You have experimentation going on in Bogota, while Colombia itself was still extremely badly governed, and a very narrow group of elites were still controlling national politics. So I think that local experimentation, which is sort of probing what is politically feasible, might be even more important.
And do you think what blocks both kinds of experimentation? Is it mostly that a problem with lack of ideas, that we have not faced up to the challenge fully, and that sort of consciousness has not permeated enough of society, or is it that you're aware of the challenges, but it's really the sort of established interest and power groups who are blocking
Interest versus ideas.
Any change, to coin a term. Yes. I mean, I've always said, for example, that the reason that there has been so much more experimentation at the municipal level in Latin America than at the national level is because there was never a Washington consensus for municipal governance. And that really what a lot of was done nationally in terms of economic policy was constrained by this notion, as of course dissipated, but there was a sort of established set of rules of behavior at the national level.
You might be right. I'm not sure. I mean, I completely agree with your criticism of Washington consensus, but I don't think that's the major barrier. Again, like the one that I'm aware, like, for example, this guy Mocus coming to power in Bogota. What he did once he was able to form a coalition in favor of change was actually very, quote-unquote, neoclassical. He privatized a lot of things because that was the only way he could actually get the tax collection to go, and he couldn't get rid of all of the political appointees that were swarmed in every part of the bureaucracy. But the big genius, and that's where ideas might come in, that he realized that an outsider coming in and saying, look, I'm going to improve public services, but I'm not going to do this by myself. I'm going to get you guys involved. And then he, in the first 2-3 years of his administration, he took all of these very symbolic gestures in order to get people involved, and then emphasizing that what he was trying to do was to change the way that politics was conducted. And so that's an idea, but it's also a sort of a concrete material thing, which is he's trying to build a new coalition that's going to impact politics. So I think it's probably both, but the ideas aren't about Washington consensus versus non-Washington consensus. They're much more about the politics of it, perhaps.
So it was an idea to relax the political constraints.
Exactly.
So the two fundamental constraints are thought and politics. In the end, right? The market doesn't create its own presuppositions. They're created in thought and in politics, and then established as law.
Any final comments? Yes.
When talking about finding relations, the first solution you mentioned was.
Can everybody hear that? Probably not. Can you speak up?
When talking about finding relations, the first solution you mentioned was fixing tax policy. My question is, how should tax policy be fixed?
I think I might have done that in various different contexts. One was just a historical context, in the context of the municipal reform.
No, specifically with respect to innovation.
Oh, innovation. So, but just since I started, let me just finish. But that I'll come there. There, the problem is that almost all of the things that we need require tax revenues, more public services, better education, and we just cannot raise taxes. And that's partly about tax rates, but much more is about the efficiency of the tax system. So that's a lot about just improving the efficiency of the tax system. In terms of the innovation, I think the tax policy, I think that's a longer discussion, but let me make 3 points. Two very minor ones, but since they haven't come up, let me make them. One is, clearly the new economic landscape, at least temporarily, but probably for longer, is generating a lot of inequality. That means that requires more redistribution. I think, we have to find ways of doing politically feasible and economically not disruptive redistribution. I think that requires a lot of thought. Second, in that context, I think some of the ideas go exactly in the wrong direction, like universal basic income, which I think is singularly the worst idea that has gripped people's attention. Not only it's the solution to the wrong problem, but it's completely infeasible. It will be extremely regressive. It will reduce redistribution massively. And it also goes in exactly the wrong direction in respect to something that I said. I think most people don't want just handouts. They want jobs. And so you want policies that actually encourage job creation and encourage people to go and get jobs rather than, give them money so that they don't go and work. The third, which I think is the one that I mentioned in the context of innovation, I think if you look at the US tax code, which is the most extreme, but the same is true in many Western countries, is that we tax employment. You have to pay employer contributions, various taxes, undertake a lot of costs, and then when it comes to the hiring of capital, we subsidize it. You get various types of tax breaks. You get accelerated amortizement. You get tax credits if you borrow, interest rate tax credit if you borrow in order to finance equipment. So at the margin, if absent taxes, we would be at an efficient point where whenever it's cost minimizing, you employ machines. Whenever it's cost minimizing, you employ labor. Now you slap this huge taxes on labor, subsidies on capital. You're going to go way into employing much more machines instead of labor. That creates both less jobs, but it also reduces productivity because you're misallocating your resources towards things that are not efficient. And if you actually look at the direction of US tax policy, it's going more in that direction of subsidizing capital at the margin.
And even without that, one might think that the social opportunity cost of labor today is much lower than the market wage at the low end of given all the social ills associated with joblessness and regional problems. So that's great. So let's all collectively thank Professor Acemoglu for being first such a gracious guest and for wonderful comments. I think Laurent, you've really taken our conversation a few steps ahead. So it's been a great contribution. Thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you.
We have to sign it.